Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, today's chapters are 2 Kings 17 and 18, and the action takes place at a place called the Washerman's Field, next to the upper pool where there's an aqueduct taking water to the great city. Now, I'm here on Hilton College property. I'm right near the reservoir up in a field. I think it's very similar to the type of environment that we base our context in today. So, in 2 Kings 17, Hoshea, the king of Israel, ruled for 9 years, wicked king. And so Shalmaneser of Assyria, the king of Assyria, came up, attacked them because he was no longer, the Israeli king was no longer paying tribute to him. So he laid siege for 3 years and deported the Israelites to Assyria. And the reason the Bible gives that this happened was because they no longer worshiped God. They put up Asherah poles, they worshipped idols, they bowed down to the starry hosts, they even sacrificed their sons and daughters. And verse 14 says, and so they followed worthless idols and they themselves became worthless. Let's pause there for a moment. One thing that characterizes the world in which we live today is idolatry. Idolatry is defined as worshipping and putting anything else other than God as sacred. Now, the DJs of many of our radio stations reflect the values of the world. No longer are they Christian values. They are anti-God. They are for the dismantling of traditional family. They are for the redefining of gender, of sexuality, of sexual practice. And they pro-abortion under the guise that it's good for women. Listen, abortion, these people in 2 Kings were sacrificing their kids on the altars. We're doing the same thing. Millions, hundreds of millions of children. Listen, human life is sacred. It's sacred because it's human and made in the image of God. Now you might say, if you follow the argument of the abortionists, well, only when a heart beats, then it's sacred. But that's logic's not even consistent. What about a guy's got a pacemaker? Do you kill him too because his heart's not beating? Well, what about when he's only when the kid's conscious of himself? He's got self-awareness. Well, what about someone in a coma? Do you kill them too? Now listen, human life is human life. You cannot take it. Some countries of the world today are even aborting kids once they're delivered on the table. They just leave them there to die. We're not far from these people, these Assyrians, these Israelites who had turned their back on God. And so what God does is he hands them over to themselves and they get taken into exile. Now, when the Assyrians occupied Samaria, what happened was lions came in. God allowed wild beasts to come in and kill some of them. And so the king of Assyria said, hang on a minute, we've disturbed their God. So we better send someone in to go and teach them how to worship their God, thinking that they're geographic gods of geographic areas. And so they send a priest that was in exile back to Samaria. And he teaches them how to worship God, with the sacrifices that the Old Testament Moses prescribed. But this is what it says. They worship the Lord, but they also serve their own gods. We call that in theological terms syncretism. Taking God and fitting him into your life. Listen, God wants your life to fit into him, not his life to fit into you. And so your business is God's business. If you believe in Jesus, it's a kingdom entity. And you don't just take God and patch him in as like an idol on the mantelpiece. When the customer comes in the door, ding dong, bell goes, there's your God sitting up on the, no. You fit into the kingdom. The kingdom doesn't fit into you. That's the mistake that they made here. Anyway, chapter 18 takes us to the greatest king that's ever lived in Israel, King Hezekiah. And he reigned for 29 years. He removed the high places, removed the sacred stones. He even took out the bronze snake that Moses made. Remember, Moses made a snake that was to represent Jesus. Jesus was going to take our sin upon himself. But what the people started to do? They start to worship the snake. Can you believe it? So he takes out the snake. Often God gives us things and we worship them. You pray for a kid. God gives you a kid, then you worship the kid. You pray for business. God gives you a business. Then you worship the business. That's what was going on here. Anyway, Hezekiah saw through that. And it says here, there was no one like him among the kings of Judah, either before or after him. He held fast to the Lord. He obeyed the Lord's commands, and the Lord was with him. And then he rebelled against Assyria. He said, I'm not going to be a slave to anyone else. I'm a slave to the Lord. Anyway, in the 14th year of his reign, the Syrian king came up against him, and so he was very clever. He just paid some tribute to the king and said, get out of my way, which is what happened. But then, a little time later, the king of Assyria sent the supreme commander of his field troops, and they stopped at the aqueduct in the washerman's field at the upper pool and called the people of Israel around him, and he said, listen, why do you think you can come against Assyria? Whose confidence are you in? Are you putting your confidence in the king of Egypt? You can't. If I gave you 2,000 horses, you couldn't even put horsemen to put on the horses. We're going to take you out, boy. And so the people that were there, not Hezekiah, he sent out his palace administrator, the secretary, and the recorder to hear what, the Assyrian king had to say. And they said, look, please speak to us in Aramaic because, our people understand Hebrew. And, he says, hey, listen, what I've got to tell to you, I want to tell to your people as well. And then he talks to the people. He says, come, forget your king. Come follow the Assyrians. How's this intimidation? This sets us up for the next chapter of how God's going to help Hezekiah handle this intimidation.